Hello, welcome to Loremaster's Library, the show where we connect real-world concepts, or in this case, history, with the tabletop experience. This month's topic is war, and we have one real-world war to go through. Another of the major medieval wars which shaped Europe. This time the 700 years known as the Reconquista. On to the players, the Iberian Peninsula had slowly been conquered by Rome at its height. But as people from the north expanded, they took much of the land for themselves at the same time they weakened Rome. One of these groups were the Visigoths, and one of the territories they expanded into was the Iberian region, where they found themselves in the 700s. On the other side, we had the spread of Islam. While the first caliphate spread across the Middle East, it was the second caliphate, the Umayyad. It's my first time ever saying this out loud. Yeah, I think it's Umayyad. Umayyad, which grew to be the largest land-wise, expanding far into Asia, and from there the Iberian Peninsula. The caliphate would only last 100 years, so it itself was only involved at the beginning of the conflict, but I can say the same about the Visigoths. And various Muslim successor states continued on with control of the region afterwards. Now, before we truly get into it, one important point of contact. There is no medieval records referring to these 700 years as Reconquista. The term is more modern and is central to Spanish identity. Likewise, during the time period, there was not as strong of an us versus them mentality to it, and oftentimes Christian and Muslim kingdoms and civilians would interact as neighbors, and just as often there would be conflicts with neighbors of the same religion as those that were different. I hope to try laying out the large picture today, as opposed to acting like everything was clear-cut the whole way through. The place where the interactions between the Umayyad and the Visigoths began were with the armies of the Berbers led by Tarq ibn Ziyad, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar, beginning the Battle of Guadalete. That's a new one. Guadalete. Close enough. At the time, the many Visigoth kingdoms were fighting amongst themselves, and most of the defending army deserted, with their commander drowning trying to retreat. Quickly afterwards, through sword or agreement, the advancing army took control of most of the peninsula. Once in control, the Umayyad restructured the region, giving it a local governor and calling their generals back home. Some more local lords even married the widows of the local rulers they conquered. They also attempted to march north of the Pyrenees Mountains and finish off the last Visigoth king, but were kept out of present-day France by the forces of the Frankish Charles Martel. And even when it was just the Muslims who populated the area, there were still tensions, in this case between the Middle Eastern Arabs and the North African Berbers. It was on the edge of the Pyrenees where two kingdoms emerged, Asturias and Navarre. Of course, as much as more modern tellings try to point this as the beginning of the grand Christian attempt to turn back the Islamic horde, the founder of Asturias, Don Peleo, was a mercenary who was willing to work with people regardless of their religion, and he just saw an opportunity for his own land and took it. And there were also their attempts to gain land from Christians across the Pyrenees themselves. But regardless, these two territories redoubled the wall that was the mountains, keeping the Umayyad from crossing. And the area was so much out in their frontiers of the central kingdom that they had no reason to invest an army of the size necessary to take the cities. So the line was drawn. At this point, the Franks were expanding their kingdom to the north. Charles Martel pushed out the Visigoths from his side of the map and had them destroyed in between them and their southern neighbors. Pippin the Short finished conquering mainland France with the capture of our old friend why am I struggling with saying Aquitaine? Aquitaine. And Charlemagne became the first Holy Roman Emperor. To ensure control of his holdings, he decided to create a sub-kingdom to the south of the Pyrenees, both boxing the still rebellious Aquitaine in and creating a hard front line with the Muslim Iberia, which at this point was independent because of the collapse of the Umayyad, and was now referred to in the Muslim world as Al-Andalus. Infighting began between the governor of Al-Andalus and the remaining of the Umayyads trying to hold territory for themselves after the collapse of the center, which eventually led to the invitation for Charlemagne to come in, with potential promises of homage. It was denied when the armies actually crossed over, and on the way back, a fourth, totally separate group, the Basque, ambushed the rearguard despite most medieval sources blaming the Muslims. Around this time too, there was a harder push into Asturias and the Franks' capture of Barcelona. From here, Barcelona became the regional capital, with three small vassal regions of Pampalo, Aragon, and Catalonia, forming the Frankish front line. In total, there was now 5 Christian nations in the upper border, though Asturias remained the only one which could do anything but defend itself inside the mountains. Around the time of the new millennium, the Crusades began. Yet as the march towards the east was continuous, the battles in Iberia remained a largely Spanish affair. Yeah, there was conferrals of praise and crusader status upon a large victory when it happened, but more often than not, those of the region were looking for loot and, let's be honest, protection money, as opposed to out-and-out conquest. Midway through, let us see how each side is doing as we wind down to the end of this era. First, our friend Asturias continued to live and raid, but finding of the remains of one of the 12 apostles, James the Greater, led to pilgrimage and with it, money. Eventually, the nation became strong enough to actually advance, where it slowly became the Kingdom of Leon. Leon, in turn, helped establish the kingdoms of Castile and Portugal through their expansions. In turn, the other early state of Navarre was established on both sides of the Pyrenees, and while it expanded to control some of the other kingdoms for a time, it would contract back in on itself and remain independent deep in the mountains even long after the Reconquista. But some of the borderlands was conquered and established itself as the independent kingdom of Aragon. On the Muslim side, as the Umayyad fell, Al-Andalus slowly broke down into several minor kingdoms called the Taifas. This was one of the reasons the Christian kingdoms were able to slowly advance, because lack of a central government and just these small kingdoms to raid. Which again, they would have advanced faster if they were more concerned with the land of the Prophet. But the main resistance came from North Africa, with the Berbers leading armies of the Almoravids and, after second disintegration to Taifas, the Almohads. The Almoravids only lost one battle in their initial advance against the legendary warrior El Cid. However, in keeping the lands, they were not as lucky. Almohad also made a good push, but the Christians formed a coalition which defeated them at the Battle of La Nave Tolosa. And in the next decade, they took all of Iberia outside of the final Muslim kingdom of Granada. Again, it was not a simple war where everything could be tracked. It was a slow march south and a slow consolidation of separate kingdoms to where all that remained was Castile and Aragon to be married, Granada to be crushed, and Portugal, which had no interest in being part of the united whole. The final battle happened in 1492. Shortly after the joint king and queen sent a man named Christopher Columbus on his first expedition, something they promised him they'd do after they crushed Granada. And that brings us to the end of today's video, and in our set of Loremaster libraries for this year. I hope you enjoyed the month of war. If you ever need something that big in a tabletop setting, it does not hurt to have a few references. So, well, this is my last true video of the year. So as always, enjoy the holidays. I hope to see you all next time.